Hi, everybody. This is William Hiley from St. Matthew's Catholic Church, and I just wanted to share with you a reflection I've been building this past several weeks, just focused around this question spurred by the Sunday readings about why do we humans seem to long for something beyond our own mortal existence, whether that's through immortality or we desire to make a legacy that lasts, or we want to get to heaven. Why do we long for that? So, drawing on scriptures, I'm going to reflect and try to unpack a bit of an answer for that, at least one from my personal experience. I'm going to use the terms transcendence to refer to things that are really far off, like beyond existence, and immanence to refer to the things that are near and close and very really experienced every day. But before I go into my reflection, I invite you to write down your answers to this question. Feel free to pause the video. So, the question: in what areas of life do you feel connected to something beyond human experience? All right, so now that you've got an answer to that question, we're going to open up some scripture and begin trying to unpack an answer. So let's start off by establishing that God is the most eternal, the most transcendent, the most holy thing there is. God is so beyond and so far out there that he's hard to comprehend. Scripture actually tells us that all things came into being through him, and without him, not one thing was made. God is the realness that underpins our reality. He is transcendent in that way. Um, but if we were to try to approach that transcendent reality, Scripture actually also tells us that that holiness, that transcendence, is dangerous to us. And if you want more information about like how that transcendence can be dangerous to us, I invite you to check out this video in the corner from the Bible Project. The crazy thing is that this transcendent God who can be dangerous to us also desires more than anything to be in and share our presence. God ultimately desires to be so close to us that he can sustain us with his own life in the same way that the sun with its heat sustains life on the earth. The problem is, and I don't think I need to be an expert on human behavior to talk about this, but that humans have since the dawn of time seemingly been inclined to choose immanent things rather than the transcendent things. Things that do not sustain us, like trying to get our own security, our own self rule, power, pleasure, popularity. And we desire all these things over God's presence. The results of that is a divide. We have cut ourselves off from our transcendent root, from the life giving power that sustains all of reality, and we don't know how to connect with God, or we forget God entirely, or we do things that are even opposed to him. We have lost our connection to the transcendent root of reality. And perhaps even weirder than that, we still long for that root. We were made to love and be loved by God, to share in his presence. And without it, we are hungry, desiring to be connected to God's presence. Fortunately for us, God doesn't just end it right there. He chooses to undertake a rescue mission on our behalf. And we begin to see that story unfolding through Exodus, when God chooses Israel, frees them out of Egypt, and then on the mountain with Moses, Moses then in turn recognizing his dependence on God for deliverance and his need for healing to be connected to God, he says, "If now I have found favor in your sight, O Lord, I pray, let the Lord go with us. Although this is a stiff-necked people, pardon our iniquity and our sin, and take us for your inheritance." And so Israel goes on a 40-year-long journey with God, learning to depend on God's presence and to be sustained by it again, by the food that truly nourishes with him. Again, the scriptures, God who brought you out of the land of Egypt, out of the house of slavery, who led you through the great and terrible wilderness and arid wasteland with poisonous snakes and scorpions. And he fed you in the wilderness with manna that your ancestors did not know, to humble you and to test you, and in the end to do you good. And so 40 years of wandering later, Israel is beginning at last to learn to depend a little bit more on God. Notice how this story works, though. In this story, we don't have humans approaching God so much as God descending down from heaven, rescuing Israel. The transcendent comes down to us. The transcendent becomes immanent. And only when the transcendent comes down and becomes immanent, near, close to us, is that now sustaining, life supporting, life giving. But sadly, Israel's story looks like a lot of the rest of ours' story. Rather than getting it all figured out and being there, they just keep messing up, and they keep chasing after other things, even when God himself comes down to dwell with them. There's actually stories of not just how they go astray, but how Israel is still too weak. It's like they're a wave crashing up against a much firmer rock of reality when they're near God. People going into God's presence are dying in these stories, not just because God is like holier or angrier than them, but because God is more real than they are, and his presence, if they approach it themselves, is still dangerous to them. So, faced with Israel's struggles again and their weakness, God goes even further now to come down from his transcendent throne to be with us. And this is where Jesus enters the story. Um, Again, scriptures tell us in the gospel that, and the word became flesh and lived among us, and we have seen his glory, the glory as a Father's only Son, full of grace and truth. This is the transcendent God coming down, not just to dwell in a temple, not just to dwell in a holy place, but to dwell in a human being. The most real, the most concrete thing that we can have a relationship with, that we can really imagine. Just as before, the presence of God, when it comes to dwell with us, when the transcendent becomes immanent and draws nearer to us, is life sustaining. For as we read in the Corpus Christi Sunday readings, Jesus tells the crowds, I am the living bread that came down from heaven. Whoever eats of this bread will live forever, a connection to the eternal, right? And the bread that I will give for the life of the world is my flesh. Jesus' presence, Jesus' eternal being coming into us that we might share in the transcendent presence of God. But let's remember that Jesus isn't just God, he's also fully human. And we really see that, and we see this connection to the transcendent in the culmination of his ministry, when Jesus, experiencing and finishing his passion, becomes a human at his most vulnerable and afflicted, when he is experiencing humanity to its deepest, all of the brokenness of humanity. And he is raised up, literally raised up on a cross between heaven and earth as a bridge between all of the messy, imminent nearness of humanity, all the things that we know, the pain, the suffering, and the transcendent God. Imagine Jesus literally there on the cross as a bridge between heaven and earth. And as St. Paul writes in his letter to the Philippians, Jesus, who though he was in the form of God, did not regard equality with God as something to be exploited, but emptied himself, taking the form of a slave, being born in human likeness. He humbled himself and became obedient to the point of death, even death on a cross. Hopefully, then, you can kind of see the pattern that emerges out of this. In the Old Testament, with Israel, God, the transcendent, distant, far off God, becomes immanent, becomes near to us, so that we might experience his transcendence, his presence, and be sustained by it. Likewise, Jesus is that same God, going from being far away in the temple, in the glory cloud, and becoming immanent, even more real to us, that we might experience his presence and be sustained by it. We see this actually even in the church today, where we believe that God comes down and is truly present in the Eucharist every single Sunday, where God humbles himself even to take on lowly bread and wine, these very imminent, very real, very near things, that we might come to experience his transcendence and his power and glory and his life-sustaining goodness. In the cross and in the Eucharist, then, the desire of the transcendent God is fulfilled to come and be near with us. And our weakness is overcome, that our desire and our connection to the transcendent that we long for may be realized. The transcendent God has made himself available to us in every circumstance because of this bridge that is Jesus, that has taken every circumstance of humanity and lifted it up into the transcendent presence of God. We yearn for that transcendence. But that transcendence is dangerous if we try to approach it on our own terms. So if you desire to encounter the transcendent God, I invite you to come to the bridge that is Jesus and bring anything that you believe needs to be healed, anything that is broken, anything that is really near to you, whatever that may be. Because Jesus said that he can bring all of that into the presence of God. Bring that to God's presence, turn back to him, and through him, through his life-giving presence, you can be made new. If you found this reflection helpful, useful, thought stimulating in your daily life, just give us a like or a subscribe down below if you're watching on YouTube or Facebook or something like that. Let me know in comments what you want to see in future reflections. Help us know how we can best minister to you. This is William Hiley from St. Matthew's Catholic Church, signing off.